Hello and welcome to Lecture 1 of Week 33 of Textual Analysis and Argumentation. This week we're reading our second Whitman poem. Of course, in Week 32 we read bits and pieces of Song of Myself, the first half of Song of Myself, to get a sense of the poetic project that Whitman is after here. And that's a poetic project of epic scope, as I think we've established reading Song of Myself. The idea with this poem is to announce the emergence of American literature on the world scene as a specifically American poetics, a specifically American literature. And to do that, Whitman tries to craft a poem and invent a poetic voice that is capable of expressing the vastness and the diversity of American culture and the American people. No easy task, but that's what Song of Myself tries to establish here. And again, it's epic in scope. This coming week, week 33, we are reading a little bit more of an intimate, quieter poem of Whitman's called Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking. And I say quieter only in the sense that this poem does not attempt to sing the entirety of the country, the entirety of America. It is a little bit more about an experience of the world, an experience of nature, and a personal experience. And I think, at least, that it's a poem that we can call a lyric poem that falls into this specific category of poetry called lyric poetry. And that's what I want to talk about today. I feel that it's an important category of poetry for you to know. The lyric poem, we haven't worked a lot with it this year, but it's something that I think you will work with in years to come. This final poem, this final text that we're reading in the course, I think, is going to be an example of a lyric poem. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a background to that category. A very messy, a little bit ambiguous category, but an important one. So today I will be lecturing about the rise and the fall and the rebirth of the lyric poem, because this particular kind of poetry was there right at the beginning of Western poetry in ancient Greece, and after the Renaissance, late Renaissance, and shortly thereafter, it sort of fell into abeyance, to use a word of Whitman's. People liked to write other kinds of poetry and read other kinds of poetry, and then it had a huge resurgence in the 19th century in England, just before Whitman is writing in America, and I'll talk more about that resurgence in just a minute. So, let's talk about the origins of this category of the lyric poem. It comes up as one of three kinds of poetry in ancient Greece, in ancient poetry in ancient Greece. The first is a narrative poem, or epic, sometimes called an epic poem. These are poems that sing and celebrate the deeds of heroes that tell about war, that tell about history. So you will probably have heard of, if not read some of, the Iliad or the Odyssey, these Homeric poems by Homer. Those are epic poems. And so the point there is to tell a story, really, of great deeds, of great tragedies, things like this. A second category is a dramatic poem, right? Whether that's in the form of an actual play or a poetic dialogue, a poetic rendering of a dialogue between people. The point there is to really, I suppose, focus on the exchange between people here, right? The drama, the tragedy, the emotion as it takes shape within a community or specifically between two speakers who are addressing each other, right? So we have the narrative poem that sings the great deeds of a nation, perhaps, the dramatic poem that focuses on this kind of interaction between people on a smaller scale. And then we have the lyric poem, or in ancient Greek, the melic poem. Melic has to do with, the etymology there has to do with air and also with melody. So the play of air, for example, on your skin, in certain kinds of weather, and also the way that a melody plays on your ears and on your emotions. So the lyric fundamentally has to do with the musical. It has its origins in musicality, right? And so the other word here besides melic, lyric, the etymology there is the lyre, right, which is a kind of harp that you see this figure playing here in this ancient painting. So mele, melody, right, is the root that we have for melody, or the play of air, and then lyra, of the lyre, right? This kind of harp. So unlike narrative poetry and its kind of epic scope, unlike dramatic poetry and its focus on human interaction, the lyric poem is more like a song. And if we want to borrow from Whitman, which I think we should here, it's a bit like a song of oneself. So that's the idea that we'll be developing in the rest of the lecture, I think. So the origins of the lyric poem, this particular kind of poetry, are in music, are in a song. I'll give you one contemporary definition of lyric poetry. And as I said at the beginning of the lecture, it's a messy category. It's not easy to define. Right? That's partly because it's not as if these kinds of names for kinds of poems are invented and then applied. They emerge from the history of poetry itself, from the development and evolution of poetry itself. So they're going to be messy. There's going to be a lot of overlap, a lot of blurry areas. But one definition that I'm taking here from a critic named James William Johnson in the new Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics, a wonderful resource, by the way, if you would like to have a kind of dictionary that explains pretty much all terms for poetry and poetics in the West. It's a great one to have. James William Johnson writes a long article on the history of the lyric poem, but and offers a number of different definitions. We'll get to some more of them in just a minute. But the basic one that he offers is this. He says that lyric poetry is poetry in which, quote, the musical element is intrinsic to the work intellectually as well as aesthetically. So that's something that we want to think about here. That's not an easy concept, I feel. The idea that you can write something where the musical element, the way it sounds, the way the poetry sings, is fundamentally built into its ideas, right? It's built into it intellectually and into the beauty of the poem in terms of what it does, how it flows, right? That's a little more easy to understand. But it's fundamental to lyric poetry that musical element is inseparable from what the poem is communicating. Back to that same form-content relationship that we spent so much time on this year. So in lyric poetry, the musical element is intrinsic to the work, intellectually as well as aesthetically. It becomes the focal point for the poet's perceptions as they are given a verbalized form to convey emotional and rational values. So again, we have, on the one hand, a kind of poetry that lays special emphasis on its musicality, on the way it sings. And then also, on the other hand, we have that musicality as inseparable from what the poem is conveying, from its values, from its ideas, and from its feeling. And somewhere in the middle between ideas and music, what links these two, what links the content of the poem, the ideas of the poem, with the music of the poem, is the poet's perceptions. So one thing that Johnson is trying to get us to see here is that lyric poetry is the poetry of the self. It's the poetry of the individual. Unlike dramatic poetry, which is between people, unlike epic poetry, which is about a whole society, perhaps. Okay, so we'll keep Johnson's definition of lyric poetry kind of on the back burner here as our baseline to work off of. And I'll just tell you very quickly this very brief sketch of the history of this kind of poetry, lyric poetry. So we know that in ancient Greece that this was a popular form, and it was literally often sung, right, by professional poetry reciters who would sing it with music. Right? By the time we get to the Renaissance, 1,000 years later or so, I'm sorry, more than that, 1,500, 1,600 years later, by the time we get to the Renaissance, there are still these kinds of poets out there. There are bards, or troubadours who are, again, professional singers of poetry who kind of wander around getting paid to sing these poems and songs, poems that are also songs, to paying audiences. That still exists, and that we can trace all the way back to ancient Greece. But there is a transition happening from that kind of singing of lyric poetry to the idea that you can actually just write it down and read it, and it will have some of the same power, that you don't actually need the singer to sing it here. here. So it's a transition from an oral history of the lyric poem to a written version of it. Right? So in Shakespeare, for instance, I think this is a good example because Shakespeare, as you know, wrote his plays for the stage, not primarily for text. He wrote them to be performed. But he is, as you also know, I'm sure, a consummate crafter of poems and poetry and verse. You guys have probably read some Shakespeare already. You'll certainly read more in the coming years. But for Shakespeare, Shakespeare is a person who, author and a poet whom we primarily read, right? So he sits right there at the transition between lyric poetry as something that is performed or sung, and lyric poetry as something that we read on the page. That's starting to happen to some extent in ancient Greece, but more so in the Renaissance period. So now we're watching the lyric move from this performative song context into a textual form. So by the time a little bit later in the Renaissance, we get to these wonderful poets, Donne and Marvell and all these other kind of late Renaissance poets in England. They write poems that are, we still want to call them lyric because they are kind of songs of the self. They are songs of what the poet is feeling, the speaker is feeling and thinking. But they are not literally sung, and they are not literally musical, right? They are just words on the page at this point. By the 18th century, and of course, as you know, that means the 1700s, by the time we get into the 1700s, people aren't really even writing lyric poetry anymore. It is not a popular, for the first time in history, really, or the second time, if you count the medieval period in Europe, it's no longer a popular form. What you get instead is a resurgence of epic poetry, songs of heroism and adventure, right, poems about those kinds of things, and also a resurgence of dramatic poetry, both in theater and drama. And in dramatic poems that have multiple speakers. The lyric, meanwhile, in the 1700s, kind of takes a back seat. It fades into the background. And, if history had been different, we might have lost the lyric poem forever in the 18th century. There's no clear reason why it came back, but it did come back. And it came back in the 1800s, right, where we are now with the course. In the early 1800s, the early 19th century, there's a movement in poetry called the Romantic movement. And I've given you a couple names of Romantic poets here that were important in this movement. William Wordsworth, John Keats, Shelley, other poets who, again, I think you will read for sure, if not later in high school, certainly in college, you will encounter these poets. The Romantic movement emphasizes subjectivity again. It emphasizes the self and the great, vast world of the self for the first time in a while. So if in the 18th century, people were kind of interested in this rejuvenation of epic and dramatic forms of poetry, the Romantics in the early 1800s really bring us back to something that we can call the lyric, a place where poetry is primarily about singing the self and the possibilities of the self. So Wordsworth, one of the most, perhaps the most important Romantic poet, defines lyric poetry as, in these terms. Right? He says that lyric poetry, and really poetry in his view in general, is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. The spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. And I think maybe you guys can see or intuit how this links back to the idea of singing a poem, the musicality of the lyric, right, as an overflow of expression, right, that comes from the self, that comes from the heart, right, rather than epic or dramatic poetry. So here in this period, in the Romantic period, we see this massive resurgence of lyric poetry, and it really redefines poetry forever. In a certain sense, it brings us full circle to the origins of poetry in ancient Greece, but it also defines the course of poetry for the 19th and the 20th centuries, largely. Poems after the Romantic period are all They are not all lyric, but they are all centered around the possibility of the lyric poem. All right, so we have this history, right? So the lyric has this initial flowering in the ancient period in Greece. It takes a bit of a nap during the medieval period in the West, and it's very much a part of the Renaissance, and then it really fades away and possibly could have just disappeared, but has this massive rebirth in the Romantic poets. And if you ask people, they will say that Whitman is not only the first kind of world-famous and successful American poet, but that he's the first American Romantic poet. Whitman is considered a Romantic poet, so he is, to some extent, part of this movement that begins in the early 19th century. Okay, so this brings us back to our initial definition of lyric poetry as musical. What's musical? What's particularly musical about it? We know in TAA, based on what we studied, that all poetry takes careful account of its sound and weaves its sound and its meaning together in ways that you've been analyzing all year. Right? So what's particularly lyrical about lyric poetry? What's particularly musical about it? Especially once it becomes just words on a page, once it becomes just text, rather than actually sung poetry. Let's take another look at a couple other definitions, and I'm going to kind of build us towards what I think, at least, and we can discuss this more in class, is particularly lyrical, particularly musical about lyric poetry. Here are a couple definitions of lyric poetry that seem to me to be too broad. A critic named Drinkwater says that a lyric poem is pure poetic energy. Lyric and poetry are synonymous terms. It's an interesting idea, but it doesn't get us much closer to defining lyric poetry as opposed to other kinds of poetry. If all poetry is synonymous with lyric, that doesn't really tell us much, right? Blackmore, another critic, says lyric poems are, in lyric poems, words build into their poetic meaning by building into sound. Again, very general, very abstract idea of lyric poetry. But again, we want to say this of all poetry, right? Whether it's epic or dramatic or lyric, all poems build their meaning into their sound to some degree. So again, we have a definition that's maybe too broad and really includes all poetry. Here are a couple definitions that I feel are maybe a little bit too narrow for lyric poetry. A critic named Murray says that lyric poetry has, quote, the quality of metrical construction or architecture. So here's another critic trying to express what's musical about lyric poetry. But the quality of metrical construction is something, again, as we know here in TAA, is true of almost all poetry that we've read so far. It all has a quality of metrical construction, right? Until we get to Whitman, of course, our first free verse poet. So again, that's maybe simultaneously too broad and too narrow, I think, right? That somehow we have to say that lyric poetry has to have a strict metrical construction in order to be lyric poetry. That's really not the case. That's not how we want to define it. It's too narrow a definition. James Johnson says lyric poetry is, quote, representative of music in its sound patterns. It approximates the tonal variation of a chant or invocation. But again, we don't want to necessarily restrict this category of the lyric to having to sound like someone chanting or invoking. That's too narrow a definition, right? It imposes laws of metrical construction on lyric poems that we really don't want to kind of impose on it. Don't we want to allow, for example, for the possibility that Whitman, in some of his poems, is writing lyric poetry, but he doesn't have a strict metrical construction. He writes in free verse. His poems may sound like a chant or invocation, but not because they are in a strict rhythm. All right, two more definitions that I think get us closer to what is lyrical about lyric poetry. James Joyce, the famous 20th century novelist, wrote that lyric poetry is the form wherein the artist presents his image in immediate relation to himself. And I think this focus on the self and the expression of oneself is really at the core here. If we can understand lyric poetry as the form of poetry that expresses the self in a musical way, there I think we've gotten to the kind of the right terrain, right? In the kind of Goldilocks and the Three Bears sense, the porridge that is just right, rather than too hot or too cold. Northrop Frye, another famous scholar and critic of the 20th century, says that lyric poetry is an internal mimesis of sound and imagery. Mimesis here just means representation, imitation, representation. So I think that Frye's use of the word internal here is important. Again, it's about the relationship between music and the expression of the self. So ultimately, I believe, or I want to suggest to you that that's how we want to define lyric poetry in a way that is not saying that it's just all poetry, but also not saying that it is only this very strict, single kind of poetry that sounds a certain way. We want to say that lyric poetry expresses lyric subjectivity, expresses a lyrical self, right? It expresses the flow of thought and feeling from that self. Right? So when we think about how we think, we know that our train of thought has a certain music to it. Our train of thought has a certain rhythm to it. Our emotions, as we go through a moment in time, as we go through an interaction with someone, follow a certain trajectory of feeling, have a certain rhythm. Right? Emotions, the progression of emotion has a certain rhythm, a certain music to it. Right? So I just, to kind of close here, I wanted to quote one last critic, one of my favorites. Her name is Helen Vendler. She teaches at Harvard, and she's a expert on poetics. And she has a great book that's named after a Wallace Stevens poem that I can point you towards if you're interested. And her book's called The Music of What Happens. And that's her phrase for poetry in general, but I think also for lyric poetry in particular, that what lyric poetry does is play us the music of what happens, not just in the world, but what happens as we perceive the world and think about it and feel about it. So that's sort of a definition, a final definition that I like. I just gave you one Shakespeare sonnet here because I think in the Renaissance even, Shakespeare is pointing towards what lyric poetry is capable of as this kind of music of thought and music of feeling. So I'll just read you this poem to close out the lecture, and the colored portions of the poem don't mean anything specific. They indicate kind of moments, different moments that we tend to have in a train of thought and in a train of feeling, different moments in that music of thought and feeling. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day, an opening sort of thought, an opening idea? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. And so an initial response to that idea. This is how we think, moment by moment. A possibility, an expansion of that possibility in specific ways. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Further expansion of that thought. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines. Here we're in a moment in this progression of thought where some kind of counterexamples are being considered, right? Some exceptions perhaps. By chance or nature's changing course untrimmed, but thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. Here we're returning to that initial idea and reaffirming it, strengthening it. And we get a kind of conclusion to this train of thought, conclusion to this succession of feelings. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. And I'll leave it there with the one suggestion that as you read Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking, consider Whitman as an epic poet which we've seen in Song of Myself, which is a song of the self, but again, the song of the self as a container for everyone and everything in this vast new nation of America, right? That is an epic poem if there ever was one. But Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking, I think, is much more of a lyrical one. And if we can start to think about it in these terms that I've talked about in this lecture, I think that'll give us a good platform for getting into the details.